Well, I finally got a copy of Umar Johnson's dissertation. You probably know him as Dr. Umar. Hold on to that thought. At any rate, Dr. Umar has been running this scam involving the Frederick Douglass Marcus Garvey Academy for, 10 years now. But it looks like he's going to lose his school within the next week or so. And so there's been a lot of banter about that on YouTube. More recently, his dissertation has surfaced, and that has raised serious questions about whether he should have received his doctorate or not. And after reading it, there are some serious problems with it. So serious, in fact, that I wouldn't have approved it if I was on the graduation committee. And in this video, I'll tell you why. Hello out there. I am trying to get through it.
With his powerful brainwaves cradled in the warmth of reasoning, it's time for Johnny Walker Dread to straighten you out on a thing or two. Emanating all the way from exciting Las Vegas, Oklahoma, it's the Johnny Walker Dread Show.
First, let me give a shout out to PhD Investigator for his insights, as well as Lennon Honor and Jay-Wit for making this dissertation available. You can view their podcast about this dissertation by clicking in the link in the description below. One of the first things that I always look at is the references. I'm not interested in how many so much, but their overall quality. If you recall, Rashad Ritchie's were absolutely abysmal, and were clearly just cited off of a listing provided during an online Google search. They included tons of magazine articles and online blog posts, like you would see in a middle school history class. A large number of them didn't even contain that which he was claiming in his arguments, while some were secondary sources that pointed to uncited and out-of-date primary sources. It was a total mess. Those issues don't seem to surface in Umar citations. Almost all entries are journal articles, and they're fairly timely, and that's good. However, as I mentioned in another video, a serious problem appears that I consider fatal. Whaley in 1993 published Self-Esteem, Cultural Identity, and Psychosocial Adjustment in African American Children. This is a pretty important paper when it comes to the whole subject of self-conceptualization amongst African American children. But Umar doesn't cite it. But, okay, an oversight. It shouldn't happen, but it does. But it gets worse. Much, much worse. There are two papers published prior to Umar's dissertation that are not only relevant, but overlap his own research almost completely. In 1995, Trustee Watts and Lim published Multidimensional Self-Concepts and Achievement in African American Middle School Students. And you'll notice that this is almost word for word the same title as Umar's. The relationship between self-concept and academic achievement in African American middle school students, a correlational study. Same topic, comparing self-concept to achievement, same population, African American middle school students. Their study included only grades 7 through 8, which we would call junior high. In 1996, Trustee Watts and Garvey House published Relationship Between Self-Concept and Achievement for African American Pre-Adolescents, where they extended their previous study to include grades 4, 5, and 6. Their results contradicted their previous study on grades 7 through 8, and that alone would make for intense discussion in Umar's dissertation. What grades did Umar study? Grades 5 through 8. But the title of his dissertation says middle school. Grade 5 is not typically middle school. In other words, Umar essentially covered the same ground as Trustee Watts, Lim, and Garvey House covered in their two studies. But Umar doesn't mention either of them in the references. He never cites them. At this point, if I'm on his graduate committee, I'm rejecting his dissertation. When you earn your doctorate, you are considered an expert on that topic, but he seems unaware of the three most relevant research studies on the topic. Now, I highly doubt that Umar overlooked those studies. So why would he ignore them? And that got me thinking that perhaps he used the same data source as those two studies, which would make his study almost completely derivative. Obviously, he cannot admit to that. If he rounded up his own participants, on the other hand, then one could argue at least that while his research is not innovative, it at least could serve as a replication study of the prior two studies. I don't think that's dissertation level research, though. So, how did he get his data? Well, let's go see. Chapter 3 is the methods section, and he claims a total of 101 student participants, of which 53 were females and 46 were males, and you can tell right away that this isn't a mathematics dissertation. And the rest of the paragraph is even more ridiculous, but that'll wait for another video. Oh wait, I'm not a social scientist. Who am I to add 46 and 53 and note that it doesn't add to 101? But enough of that. Let's read on. And it says right here, as archival data were used, so he didn't form his own populations at all. He simply took existing data and analyzed it. Gee, I wonder whose studies provided that data. He says right here that archival data were obtained during the 2007-2008 academic school year and included report card grades, the harder SPPC inventories, and responses to 6 open-ended questions answered after completing the harder SPPC. But who questioned these students? If it was Umar, then this is not archival data. If it wasn't Umar, then who? I poured through the document, and I couldn't find mention of the data source anywhere. So there's no way to check Umar's claims. And for the record, I don't believe that anybody should get a doctorate using archival data. Part of the doctoral program is to prove that you can conduct research on your own. So you should have to show your graduate committee that you know how to form populations, administer studies to populations, get IRB approval, all those things. When you use archival data, you don't have to do those things. And so it makes it too easy. But that's just my opinion. A bit further down, it discusses these open-ended qualitative questions in more detail. But again, there isn't even a hint on who wrote the questions. And by the way, there are serious problems with these questions, which I will cover in my next video. The procedures section provides more clues. Evidently, it was one school in Philadelphia. Umar is from Philadelphia. He mentions that an examiner administered the questions, but doesn't tell us whether this examiner was a teacher, staff member, or himself. In the acknowledgement section, he mentions that Dr. Tamara Thomas Smith helped him secure the data. From where? Who knows? But again, Umar is writing this section as if he administered the study to a population of school children in Philadelphia, but that would require a high-level approval from an institutional review board. If this study was truly archival and Umar never disclosed the source of this data, under no circumstances should his graduate committee approve his dissertation. So what do I think happened? Well, I have no proof, but I think Umar had originally planned to make up a story that he had gone into a Philadelphia middle school and administered this study. All would have gone well, but at some point it became clear that he couldn't do that without getting IRB approval. And because this study involved student grades and discussions on their self-worth, that wouldn't have been easy. The IRB would have had little trouble sniffing out Umar's complete lack of preparation or outright fraud. So he changed his data source to archival, which would lower the IRB requirement to exempt. He still has to get IRB approval, but that would be far easier, and they would ask far fewer questions. After all, what are the chances that archival data on the very topic he wants to study is available from classrooms in the very city that he lives? Now, the other possibility that I mentioned before is that he got his data from the studies by trustee and colleagues, and he doesn't want to reveal that because it would open his research to too many questions. That would explain why he chose not to cite them. Could his data be legit? Well, maybe, but it's incumbent on the author to persuade the reader that his study has merit. Not citing the most relevant research and not citing the source of your data, that's not how it's done. Research like Umar's is the reason that we now have to upload our datasets to public archives. Back in the day, you used to have to email the author. I did that many years ago when analyzing the meta-analysis of John Hattie, whose work I find downright worthless. And no, Hattie never responded to my request. In part 2, we'll dive deeper into the methodology. In the meantime, like my video and subscribe to my channel.